One cannot imagine Egypt without the Nile River. In fact, Herodotus, over 2,000 years ago, famously remarked that Egypt itself was the gift of the Nile. And even before his time, the Egyptians themselves praised their river in hymns. Hail to thee, O Nile, who comes to give life to Egypt. That's a deep reverence, and it shows how crucial the Nile was to daily life. So I want you to imagine yourself in the shoes of an Egyptian farmer. It's 1500 BCE, and you've just stepped out onto your plot of land as the sun has gone up and the floodwaters have receded, leaving a rich layer of black soil. You gaze at the great river that made this soil so fertile. Your entire year, your entire survival, and the prosperity of your family all depend on the Nile's flood cycles. We're about to explore the world of an ancient Egyptian farmer, the life of not a king or a warlord, but just a very ordinary Egyptian person during the Bronze Age. So if you'll come with me, we can spend the next hour together, and I'm sure we'll learn something along the way. But allow me to welcome you to the channel first. Good to see anyone returning, and hello to the newcomers. More Egyptian history for you today. If you're yet to subscribe, I invite you to do so. And I also remind you that this video and the entire channel is ad-free, which is great news for all of us. No one likes to be interrupted by that, especially these days when there's ads absolutely everywhere. Perhaps this is a space for you where you can be confident that you won't encounter them. We can do this because we are actually crowdfunded. Things like the merch store, the occasional donation through Super Thanks and Patreon, the PayPal rather, but yes, the Patreon and the YouTube members too, which make up the bulk of our support. So thank you again to those on that prestigious list. A list of, if you would like to join, you may find in the pinned comment, the video or channel description. Other than that, do the normal like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button for the algorithm. You know what to do. And with all that being said, let us begin our journey back to the life of a farmer on the Nile in the Bronze Age. Of course, we all know that the Nile River was the heartbeat of that great Egyptian civilization. Without the Nile, there would simply be no Egypt. Every year in the late summer, the river would swell up and its banks would overflow across the flat floodplain. And this annual inundation, known to the Egyptians as Akhet, the flood season, deposited a layer of dark, fertile silt over those farmlands. The Egyptians actually called their river Ar, meaning black, referring to this rich soil. When the waters withdrew, the land was left renewed and ready for planting. In a good year, under ideal conditions, these floodwaters turned Egypt's fields into some of the most productive farmland in the ancient world. So fertile were the fields that they could produce much more than enough grain to feed the entire population for an entire year, and that's with a bit of surplus left over. That surplus was stored in state granaries for trade, or perhaps for lean times. A bad growing season was almost always the result of a poor Nile flood. If you had one of them on your hands, people would tend to panic quite a lot. And of course, the ancient Egyptian calendar and world view were deeply tied to the Nile. Their year began with the first month of the flood, and they personified the inundation as a deity, that is, Hapi, the god of flood and fertility. Now all Egyptians recognized that without the Nile flood, the land would be barren, completely useless, and everybody would just starve to death if they didn't move somewhere else. But if the floods were too low, or even too high, disaster could strike. Not enough water, bad. Too much water, also bad. Egyptian texts recount that when the Nile failed, famine would always follow. One account even speaks of people driven to cannibalism. Such extremes once again show the Nile's importance. When it behaved normally, it was a celebrated giver of life, kind of like the artery running through the ecosystem of Egypt. And of course, the other side of that coin is when it failed, well, it brought disaster and despair. But fortunately, most years, the Nile's behavior was pretty predictable, at least predictable enough that Egyptian society flourished for millennia on its bounty. But geography did create some regional differences in farming. In the broad, marshy Nile Delta in the north, we're talking up near Alexandria, you can still see how green it is on the map even in our modern day. Water was plentiful, and the soil was especially fertile. Delta farmers could often rely on natural flood distribution among the many branches of the river. But in contrast, in the narrow valley of Upper Egypt to the south, they call it Upper Egypt because of the flow of the Nile, so Lower Egypt being the north, Upper being the south, the fields hugged the river's edge in a thin strip. Upper Egyptian farmers, remember those in the south, had to be a little more inventive, let's say, to channel those floodwaters onto the distant fields. And so, from an early date, they learned to cooperate with neighbors in digging irrigation canals and drainage ditches to direct water wherever it was needed the most. This cooperation was not just practical, but became almost a moral imperative. Interfering with someone else's water supply was a grave offense, so much that in the Egyptian negative confessions, that is, if you're not familiar, kind of list of sins that a soul declares it did not commit in the afterlife, one vow was, quote, I have not obstructed water in another's canal. Well, managing water, of course, was seen as a sacred duty of the community and its leaders. Local officials were responsible for maintaining canals and sluices, and they could be fined if they let waterways fall into disrepair, or if any water was wasted. The state sometimes organized large-scale hydraulic projects as well. During the Middle Kingdom, for example, the pharaohs undertook major irrigation works in the Fayum oasis, building little dams and canals to divert flood water into a lake for storage, and of course to reclaim new farmland. Such ambitious projects expanded the agricultural land, albeit primarily for the state's benefit, but well, it was them who were organizing it, so fair enough. But they were only possible with organized labor directed by central authorities. As for the hard work, well, it was up to the common man to roll up his sleeves. All for the greater good, I'm sure. And speaking of the common man, how did he fit into this landscape of floods and receding waters, all the rest? Well, life for the Egyptian farmer followed a seasonal rhythm, and it was all dictated by the Nile cycle. The agricultural year was divided into 3 main seasons, not 4. Now, the first was Akhet, which we've mentioned. That is the inundation, roughly from mid-July to October in our calendar. And during Akhet, the fields were underwater. You couldn't get much planting done with that. This wasn't idle time, however. Farmers used these months for other tasks, and there was plenty to do. Many performed maintenance on the irrigation system, dredging silt from canals, strengthening dams, and readying the earth for when the waters would finally retreat. The state also took advantage of this off-season to conscript farmers for labor on royal projects. Thus, during flood season, an average farmer might find himself hauling stones for a tomb or temple, quarrying blocks for a pyramid, or maybe digging new canals under the eye of a scrutinizing supervisor. There is evidence from inscriptions and later Greek accounts that large building projects like the pyramids were accomplished using labor from farmers when their fields were submerged. Not slave labor, by the way. That's been long debunked. In any case, this labor duty, a form of corvée labor, was a kind of tax paid in work instead of produce. And the laborers were compensated too. Rations of food and beer. The food was often things like onions, that kind of thing, which Egypt was quite abundant with. But that doesn't mean it wasn't hard work. There's only so many onions and beer that you can drink. But it did keep the population employed, and the state projects moving forward during the Nile's high water period. Progress does not grind to a halt because of the weather, after all. In any case, by mid-autumn, the inundation waters receded, leaving behind waterlogged, freshly deposited earth. This marked the start of the second season, which is called Peret, that is, the growing season, approximately November to February. As soon as the floodplain had drained enough to walk on, farmers hurried to plow and sow the fields while the soil was still soft. The timing for all this was quite critical. You see, the moisture left in the ground would sustain the seeds at germination, and crops needed to establish before the land dried out. Plowing was typically done with light wooden plows, and they were drawn by oxen. Tomb paintings and little wooden models from tombs show teams of oxen pulling plows, guided by a farmer who used one hand to steady the plow and another to guide the animals. But on large estates, a two-stage plowing method was sometimes used. A heavier plow, or mattock, first cut crude furrows, and a second, lighter plow followed to turn the soil over. If a farmer didn't have oxen or a proper plow, he and his family resorted to manual labor, which, well, is quite hard work, of course. Now, a common hoeing tool was simple, a wooden blade on a short handle, just like you'd see in the modern day, but not with that iron fixture and all the rest. But using it required the farmer to work bent over, hacking and turning clods of earth by hand. Not easy. An ancient scribe exaggeratingly described the farmer at this stage as having to toil until his fingers turned to sores from breaking up the mud. The image is somewhat embellished, but it does convey the effort required to prepare fields for planting. Once the earth was plowed and broken up, the sowing would take place. Egyptian farmers sowed grain by broadcasting, that is, walking through the field, casting handfuls of seed evenly across the ground. A farmer might carry a large basket of seed on his hip, or maybe strapped across his shoulders, flinging the grain with broad sweeps of his arm. And after sowing, the seeds needed to be covered or pressed into the soil. For this task, the Egyptians cleverly enlisted their livestock. They would drive herds of sheep, goats, or pigs back and forth across the field to trample the seeds into the soft mud. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, was amazed at this practice. He noted an Egyptian, quote, sows his plot of ground, then turns swine into it. The swine tread in the corn, and after that, he awaits the harvest. In the eyes of Herodotus, Egyptian farming seemed almost effortless compared to the harder plowing and hoeing needed in Greek fields. That is, of course, thanks to the Nile's deposit of soft soil. Of course, real Egyptian farmers did work very hard, but the use of animal trampling was an efficient way to plant without extensive harrowing. And so, with the fields sown by early winter, the crops began to grow. The main staple crops were cereal grains, emmer wheat and barley, used to make bread and beer, That was what formed the core of the Egyptian diet. Other important crops included flax for linen fiber, papyrus for making paper and other goods, and various vegetables like onions, garlic, lettuce, beans, lentils, things like that. During the growing season, once again called peret, farmers turned their attention to irrigation and crop maintenance. The Nile's receding flood usually left behind enough moisture for the first part of the growing period. But as the weeks passed, additional watering was often needed. Farmers opened small canals and channels to lead water from the nearest river branch or canal into their fields. They built low mud barriers to hold water around the crops, a method of basin irrigation, ensuring the water soaked in deeply. And so as the dry months progressed, lifting water became a daily task. Egyptian farmers invented a device called the shaduf around the time of the New Kingdom, that is about 1500 BCE, and this was used to assist in irrigation. Think of it like this, a kind of simple lever and pulley mechanism. Basically a long pole balanced on a frame with a bucket hung from one end and a counterweight on the other. By pulling the bucket end, a farmer could fill the bucket from the canal, and then the counterweight helped swing the bucket back up and pour it into an irrigation ditch. This allowed water to be lifted from lower depressions to higher fields or garden plots. The shaduf was pretty genius. It greatly extended the area that could be farmed away from the direct banks of the Nile, though it required continuous manual effort. Scenes of Egyptian farmers using shadufs show it in action. A man pulling the rope to dip the bucket, and then another, or perhaps the same man emptying the water onto the thirsty plains. Well, before the shaduf's introduction, all water lifting had to be done with jars, so this device was a pretty significant innovation of its time. Still, for an average small plot, much irrigation was done simply by opening a channel to let water flow in by gravity when river levels were adequate. In any case, while crops matured, farm families also protected and tended them. One big challenge was keeping animals and pests out of the fields. Farmers posted family members or hired boys as scarecrows. Not the inanimate kind either. They would actually be there shouting, clapping, slinging stones to frighten away flocks of birds looking to eat the freshly sown seeds or the ripening grain. In paintings, these bird scarers are sometimes shown standing on small platforms or mounds in the fields, whirling around slings and whatnot. Wild animals like gazelles and hippos in earlier times could also damage crops, so fields were often watched and sometimes fenced with reed barriers. Weeding was another necessary chore, though not one that people would generally volunteer for. Teams of workers, including women and children, moved through the rows plucking out weeds to reduce competition with the crops. But despite these efforts, Egyptian farmers might have viewed the growing season as a somewhat easier time compared to plowing or harvest. The days were a lot cooler, and there were moments when one simply had to wait, just trust the Nile and the sun to do what they do best. In any case, by early spring, roughly March in our calendar, the fields of wheat and barley turned from green to golden, signaling the third season, that is Shemu, the harvest season from March to June. Harvest was a time of intense labor, but also intense reward. Farmers and their families rose before dawn to beat the heat and went out with sickles to reap the grain. Ancient Egyptian sickles were curved blades set in a handle. Many early sickles had a wooden or bone handle with sharp flint blades embedded along the curve. And as for flint, we should mention that it remained in use for quite a long time, not because it was the best technology, but mainly because it was abundant, and did a pretty good job of sewing through the stalks effectively, even as bronze tools became widely available. In any case, by the New Kingdom, some sickles were made entirely of bronze, but flint-edged sickles are still found in later periods, indicating that for many farmers, stone tools were good enough, and of course they spared the expense of metal. Reaping was usually done by men, cutting the stalks close to the ground. Women and children followed behind the cutters to gather the fallen stalks and tie them into bundles. The work was hot. The sun was intense at harvest time, so workers often only wore light linen garments, or even just a loincloth. A famous tomb painting from the Old Kingdom shows a harvesting scene with men sweating in the fields and pausing for a drink of water or beer offered by the women. A vignette that feels quite familiar to real life. In any case, after cutting, the grain had to be processed. Bundles were carried to a threshing floor, an area of hard ground or plastered surface. There the dry bundles were spread out and trampled by livestock to separate the grain kernels from the stalks. Farmers used their oxen or donkeys for this, driving them in circles over piled sheaves. Sometimes 2 oxen would be yoked together, pulling a sled, or just their own hoofs did the work, crushing and loosening the husks. To someone watching, it would raise clouds of chaff and dust into the air around them. Once the threshing was judged to be sufficient, the straw was removed, and the remaining mix of chaff and grain was winnowed. Winnowers scooped up the broken material in flat baskets and tossed it into the breeze, often in the late afternoon when the winds were steady enough to do so. The lighter chaff and bits of stalk blew away, while the heavier grain fell back into the basket or onto the mat. By repeating this, tossing it all around and up into the air, clean grain could be collected. This whole process was typically a communal effort. Many hands make it faster, and often neighbors would join in, moving from field to field. Finally, the cleaned grain was measured and stored. Large clay storage jars or silo bins were filled with the year's yield. A portion of the harvest, sometimes a large portion, was then taken as a tax or a rent. And we'll discuss more on that in a moment, but from the farmer's perspective, this was the moment of truth. It all came down to this very hour. How much of the crop would remain for his family's use after the obligations were met. Whatever grain the family kept would be their staple food for the year, and the seed for the next planting, so it had to be carefully managed. Now, if a farmer was wise, or if he had means, he would aim to store extra grain in good years as insurance against the bad ones. Archaeology has found remains of mud brick granaries, even in small villages, indicating that storing grain was central to life at every scale of society. Harvest time was also a period of celebration and anxiety mixed together. When the yield was good, there was celebration and rejoicing. Egyptian communities gave thanks to the gods for the bounty. They might offer the first sheaf of grain at a local shrine of the harvest goddess or of Osiris, a god associated with vegetation and rebirth, if you're not familiar. There would be feasting with freshly brewed beer. Perhaps they'd even slaughter a goat if the village was flush with grain. So folks could relax a bit, knowing that food was secured. Conversely, when the Nile's flood had been poor and the harvest was thin, well, the farmers faced a difficult year ahead. Letters from the Middle Kingdom illustrate those fears in a set of documents known as the Hekanakte letters, which were around 1950 BCE. A landowner named Hekanakte writes to his family about rationing their grain during the shortage. He warned them not to complain, insisting that reduced rations were better than starving. Essentially, half of life is better than none. And in one report, Hekanakte claimed people in the region were so desperate they had begun eating each other. This may have been an exaggeration born of panic, but it certainly shows how catastrophic a failed harvest could be. In any case, thanks to Hekanakte's careful management, his household apparently survived without hunger. But his letters convey the very real concern that the normal Egyptian farmer had when looking at an emptying granary and wondering if the Nile would rise adequately the next year. So, what about the basic toolkit of an Egyptian farmer? It didn't change too much over the centuries, but it was pretty simple and pretty effective, though with a few refinements here and there. The primary tools were pretty much what you could imagine: the plow, the hoe, and the sickle, as described above. Early plows were all wood. Later, the farmers sometimes fitted a bronze or copper blade onto the plow tip to help cut harder soil. But the problem is metal was expensive, so even in the Bronze Age many farmers continued to use wooden ard plows without any metal parts. The strength of their oxen and the moisture of the Nile mud, they were usually sufficient to break the ground. The hoe, used for smaller plots and garden beds, and for tasks like weeding or breaking clods, changed a little. A broad blade of wood, or wood with a stone blade in some cases on a short handle. One area of technological progress was in irrigation aids. The introduction of the shadoof in the New Kingdom era was one such advance, as we discussed. But in later periods after the Bronze Age, the Egyptians would adopt even more complex water-lifting devices, like the sakia, a water wheel turned by oxen during Persian and Ptolemaic times. But in the Bronze Age context, irrigation was still largely a manual art, measured by the sweat of farmers hauling water or operating shadoofs under the hot sun. The layout of irrigation canals and ditches was another technology in its own right. Villages often had a designated official or experienced elders who directed where new ditches should be dug or how existing ones should be apportioned among fields. This traditional knowledge of water management was passed down through generations. Egyptian farmers even trained baboons, believe it or not, to climb trees and harvest fruit, as depicted in tomb scenes. Pretty clever way to extend their reach. They should have trained them to use the shadoofs, I suppose, or just do the entire job of farming. I suppose you only have so many baboons around. They'll start unionizing. But they also employed other animals too. For example, cats were used to keep rodents out of granaries, dogs to guard and herd livestock. The reliance on animals was pretty integral. Oxen and donkeys were the tractors and trucks of ancient Egypt. A farmer with a sturdy pair of oxen could till more land and transport heavier loads than one without. As for the main pack animals, they were the donkeys. They carried seed to the fields and sacks of grain back to the village after harvest. It was a common sight to see a line of donkeys plodding along a path, laden with sheafs or jars of beer, driven by a farmer or his children. But for longer trips, say to take surplus grain to market or deliver the tax quota to a central granary, the Nile itself was the highway. Farmers would load goods onto small boats. Even simple rafts of bundled papyrus or wooden skiffs could float bales of wheat downstream. Thus the river served not only as a giver of water and soil, but also as the chief transport route for agricultural products. One aspect of farming that often goes unmentioned, but was critical in Egypt, was storage and preservation. The granary was a farmer's bank, constructed of mud brick with thick walls, often in a beehive shape or as rectangular silos. Granaries protected grain from pests and humidity, as much as was possible in that climate. Within the household, smaller bins and large clay jars stored the family's provisions. To avoid spoilage, grain might be dried thoroughly before storage, and sometimes smoke was used to deter insects. Archaeologists have found remains of grain storage facilities in many excavations, and that shows once again their importance. But to really understand the life of a farmer, you have to step into the village and home. You see, most Egyptian farmers lived in small villages, maybe a few hundred people, and that's being generous, often much smaller hamlets, strung out along the Nile or near the edges of the floodplain. The houses were made of mud brick, using the very Nile mud and straw that their fields produced. A typical peasant house was pretty modest as well, a rectangular structure with 1 to 3 rooms, perhaps, a flat roof. The floor plan was pretty simple. Perhaps a main room for living and sleeping, a back room for storage, a roof terrace where family members could sleep on hot nights or dry their crops and laundry. The walls were plastered with mud, and sometimes they were whitewashed with lime to reflect heat. There were few windows, of course, and we don't mean glass windows. We just mean things that keep out heat and dust. And the interiors were quite dim, so much of daily life took place in the courtyard or street in front of the house. In the courtyard, a family might have a small clay oven for baking bread, a quern for grinding grain, and containers of water. They might keep a goat or a pig in a penned corner, and chickens were likely scurrying about. Chickens actually became common in later periods, but earlier ducks and geese were a bit more prevalent. But now we're just getting technical, aren't we? The roof of the house, supported by a palm log beam, was usually used for storage. For instance, storing jars of grain or hanging bunches of onions and garlic was pretty common. Now, the daily meals of a farming family were pretty humble, but not bad by the standards of the day. Bread and beer were the staples, and every morning someone, usually the woman of the household, or perhaps the daughters too if they had them, would grind grain into flour. This was done by kneeling and rubbing a handheld grinding stone back and forth over a large flat stone cairn. And it was pretty hard work too, kneeling and rubbing grain on a stone for hours, but it produced the coarse flour for that day's bread. The flour, often gritty with a bit of stone dust, was mixed with water and perhaps yeast to a sourdough starter. Then formed into dough, of course. They would bake the dough in a small domed clay oven or on flat griddles over a fire, producing flatbreads or loaves of various sizes. Now, these loaves were the main source of calories for most Egyptians. Of course, as we mentioned, beer was the other essential item. Beer in ancient Egypt was a thick, nutritious brew made from fermented barley bread. One common brewing method was to partially bake barley dough, crumble it into water, and add dates or malt for sugars. Then you would let it ferment in large jars. Pretty much what you'd get out of this was a porridge-like beer. It was rich in carbohydrates and vitamins. It was, I suppose you could say, liquid bread. That's effectively what you got. Drunk daily by adults and children alike, with low alcohol content too compared to modern beers. And it provided hydration and nourishment. But besides bread and beer, farmers ate what vegetables they had from their gardens. Onions, leeks, cucumbers, pulses like lentils and peas. Occasionally fruits like dates and figs. Meat was rare for ordinary folk, typically reserved for feast days. A family might keep a few pigeons or ducks and eat one now and then, or slaughter a goat for a festival. But fish was more commonly accessible. If near a canal or the river, the farmer or his children might catch fish which could be grilled fresh or sun-dried for storage. Clothing for the farmer and his family was simple and dictated by the climate. Men generally wore a linen kilt or loincloth while working in the fields, and many farmers often worked barefoot and shirtless, wearing just a wrap around the waist. Some reliefs even show field laborers completely naked, which might not have been common, but indicates how minimal clothing could be in scorching fields. Women, wore straight linen dresses with shoulder straps, often called a sheath dress, or a wrapped skirt and blouse. The linen cloth was usually undyed, that is, a kind of off-white color, and woven at home from the flax that they grew. Children in peasant families often went without clothing until about puberty age, especially in the summer. It was practical, and saved wear on garments. In winter or cooler nights, people might don a wool cloak or heavier linen tunic for warmth, but thick clothing was rarely needed, not for too long in Egypt's climate. Both men and women often kept their hair short or shaved for comfort and cleanliness. Wigs or elaborate hairstyles were more a thing for the wealthy. The peasants' feet were usually bare or in simple sandals, woven from papyrus reeds. Despite long work hours, Egyptian farmers had their forms of leisure and community life. Families likely gathered in the evenings to share food and stories, and there was music and dance enjoyed at the community level. Someone might play a flute, another might beat a drum, this kind of thing. Excavations have found harps and flutes even in modest tombs, suggesting that music wasn't just something for the elite. And then there were the games. They were part of life too. A popular pastime was a board game called Senet, involving moving pieces across a grid according to dice rolls or sticks. Traces of what could be Senet boards scratched into floors have been found, implying that even common people amuse themselves with board games. Additionally, there were simple sports and activities. Young men might wrestle or practice archery. Children played with clay dolls, balls, and spinning tops. We found all sorts of these things, not just in tombs, but in house ruins. Of course, religion was the thing that permeated daily life for everyone, and a farming family paid respect to many gods and spirits. In the home they might have a small shrine, or clay figurines of household gods. For example, Bes, the dwarf god who protected children and pregnant women, or maybe Tawaret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Before sowing or at harvest, they might say a prayer or make a tiny offering, like a bit of beer poured onto the ground to the gods of such fertility, such as Osiris or Renenutet, that is a cobra-headed goddess of the harvest. The village would have its local shrines too, and on festival days everyone would celebrate together. So one can imagine the festival of Opet, or local festivals of Min, a god of fertility, being observed with beer, music, processions. The farmers all joining in to take a break from work to honor the deities that they believed ensured the Nile's flood and soil's fecundity. Socially, the farmers' world was tightly knit, but it was also hierarchical. Villagers helped each other, as seen in practices like gleaning, after the official harvesters, often working for a landowner, had cut the fields. Local poor families, usually women and children, were allowed to follow and gather any stray grain that was left behind. Tomb illustrations show women gleaning harvests behind the people who were doing the main work, and texts indicate it was an accepted custom. It provided a kind of safety net for those less fortunate, and ensured that nothing was wasted. In the village, farmers' wives engaged in informal barter markets. One woman might trade a jar of her homemade beer with another for some fish or maybe some extra cloth. These small exchanges formed the basis of the local economy, and there was no cash at all in ancient Egypt, no coinage until much later periods, so barter was essential. Goods were directly exchanged according to their perceived value, and they even had a notional unit of value, the deben, which was a weight of copper, to quote prices, but actual payment was in kind. Thus, a farmer might buy a new pair of sandals by bartering a sack of wheat, and the sandal maker might accept the grain, knowing it could be traded onward for something else that he needed, or he might just eat the grain. But within the broader Egyptian society, our farmer was near the bottom of the social pyramid in status, if you'll forgive the wording. Yet it was absolutely foundational in importance. Ancient Egyptian sources don't mention individual peasant farmers by names quite often, but they do frequently acknowledge the produce of their labor. Grain, vegetables, flax, animals. That's the real wealth of the nation. Farmers were typically tenant farmers rather than landowners too, and much of the arable land was owned by the state, i.e. the pharaoh, the temples, or just the noble families. A farmer usually worked a plot that was part of one of those estates. Each year he owed a certain amount of grain as a rent or tax. If he produced more than that quota, he could keep the surplus. But if not, he could fall into debt. There were certainly some independent farmers who owned small plots, but even they owed taxes to the state. I'm afraid it's a tale as old as time, the government coming to get their greedy hands on all of your money or your grain, whatever it is. We could have pretty normal conversations with ancient people about those kinds of complaints, I think. And so we should talk about the relationship between the peasant farmer and the state in ancient Egypt. Just like our modern day, it's a constant push and pull. The state relied on farmers to produce the surplus that fed the cities, armies, and the non-farming specialists, and the farmers in turn relied on the state to maintain order, the irrigation infrastructure, and to appease the gods for good floods. The pharaoh was often depicted in royal propaganda as a great provider, sometimes called, quote, Lord of the two lands who gives life-giving floods to his people. But in reality, of course, it was the natural Nile that gave the flood, but they weren't going to tell them that, weren't they? But give credit where it's due. The pharaoh's governance did organize and distribute a lot of the water and storage of its produce. So there is that. In any case, after the harvest, government scribes gauged the yield and took a state share, typically a substantial percentage of the grain as a tax. They used nilometers, stone flood gauges, to anticipate the harvest and set tax expectations. A high Nile meant a bumper crop and heavy taxes. A low Nile meant shortages and hardship, though tax demands did not always relent accordingly. Scribes and tax collectors would arrive in villages to record how many sacks of grain each farm produced, and to collect the required portion for the state. Many documents survive of scribes accounting, meticulously noting fields, yields, and taxes. If a farmer tried to hide some of his harvest to reduce his tax, the officials were charged with preventing that. A text from the New Kingdom advises a local official to watch the threshing floor, implying peasants might try to tuck away grain before the tally. Tax grain was taken to regional granaries and eventually to central storehouses to feed government workers, soldiers, and craftspersons, and to be used as a reserve in case of famine. In this sense, the agricultural economy of Egypt was redistributive. Farmers paid taxes in grain, and that grain was redistributed to others as rations or used in trade. In return, or at least in principle, the state took care of the larger-scale needs. The government oversaw major canal dredging, dam building, and basin maintenance, beyond the capacity of small villages, that is. But during calamities such as unusually low floods, the pharaoh could order emergency grain distributions from the state granaries to prevent starvation. There are inscriptions claiming such acts of mercy by benevolent rulers. A Middle Kingdom text, known as the 11th Hour Summons, describes officials organizing boats of grain to be sent to Upper Egypt during a famine, suggesting some central relief efforts occurred. Whether the average farmer could always rely on such help, that's kind of uncertain. But the ideology was that the pharaoh, as a semi-divine ruler, cared for his people like a shepherd for his flock. And indeed, Egyptian kings sometimes emphasized their role in ensuring agricultural prosperity. Many built or enhanced temples to the Nile gods, offered prayers and rituals to guarantee good floods. and in their inscriptions took credit for the making the Nile rise when it had failed. Maybe a little bit of poetic license, no doubt about that. But even justice and law in Egypt intersected with a farmer's life. There are recorded cases of farmers bringing complaints against local officials who mistreated them. One famous Middle Kingdom tale, The Eloquent Peasant, tells of a poor farmer who is robbed by a corrupt official, and then eloquently petitions the authorities for justice. The story is a bit idealistic. It shows a peasant receiving a fair hearing, reflecting the notion that even commoners were entitled to justice under Mart. It is the principle of cosmic truth and order. But in reality, a peasant's ability to get justice depended greatly on the goodwill of the higher-ups. But the existence of the story does indicate that fairness was valued. Perhaps it was not a reality, but it wasn't ideal. Better than nothing, I suppose. Well, religion also played a part in the state-farmer ownership, relationship, rather. The farmer was told by scribal teachings and temple decrees that the gods by the pharaoh made the Nile flood and the crops grow. So many farmers willingly gave a share of produce to local temples as offerings. Temples in Egypt also owned extensive lands farmed by peasants, and the yield from those lands supported the cult of the god and the priests. For example, the great temple of Amun at Thebes in the New Kingdom had vast estates and whole villages of farmers, whose taxes went not to the royal treasury, but to the temple granaries. In practical terms, the difference might not have mattered much to the farmer. Grain was grain, after all, whether it fed bureaucrats in Memphis or priests in Thebes. But it added a layer of piety to a contribution. A surviving text lists a man's donations to a temple, and it counters in terms of pious duties rather than tax. Still, doesn't take the sting away of having it taken away. Tax is never good, no matter how they word it. But one cannot overstate the prosperity of ancient Egypt, which awes us in pyramids and treasures, and it was all fundamentally built on the backs of its farmers and the bounty of the soil. The higher classes were well aware of this, even as they sometimes disparaged manual labor. A Middle Kingdom didactic text by Ketty called The Satire of the Trades humorously complains about the life of various workers, especially the farmer, painting him as a wretchedly muddy and tired person scolded by overseers, or to convince a student to become a scribe instead. Now, while it is satirical, it does reveal genuine hardships that farmers faced. Long hours, physical exhaustion, and often quite scant appreciation. Yet tomb scenes of nobles regularly celebrated the abundance their farms produced, with detailed depictions of farmers plowing, harvesting, and bringing in great piles of grain, vegetables, and animals as offerings. And as those scenes that breathe a certain pride and satisfaction in agricultural plenty. Even if individual farmers remained nameless, their work was respected, in the abstract, as the very source of Egypt's wealth. But farming along the Nile changed remarkably little in its core practices, from the earliest times to the Bronze Age and beyond. This continuity was mainly due to the Nile's reliable nature and the time-tested methods that Egyptian farmers developed to make the most of it. If one of the first farmers from pharaonic Egypt, say 2500 BCE, were magically transported to 500 BCE, he'd find the pretty basic agricultural routine familiar. He would still wait for the inundation, still plow with oxen, sow by hand, irrigate with canals and shadoufs, and harvest with sickles. Many tools and techniques remained, appropriate technology for thousands of years. But of course, that being said, there were gradual changes. Over the span of the Bronze Age, Egyptians came into contact with neighboring civilizations and adopted a few crops. For example, pomegranates were introduced from the Near East and became a valued fruit. Olive trees also arrived. though Egyptian climate limited olive cultivation, and they never really rivaled the traditional sources of oil like linseed or castor oil. New vegetables like chickpeas and fava beans were added into the diet in the New Kingdom or later, supplementing the older staples of lentils and peas. The New Kingdom also saw the introduction of the horse with chariots by the Hyksos, but horses were used for war and prestige, not farming. That was the oxen's job. In terms of tools, the Bronze Age did eventually allow more metal implements in agriculture. Early Bronze Age Egypt used mostly copper. True bronze became common by the New Kingdom, that is, a copper alloyed with tin. We start to find bronze plowshares, bronze sickles, and metal carpentry tools in that era, which would have made certain tasks more efficient and durable. However, metal was never cheap in Egypt. You see, tin had to be imported from far away, so many poorer farmers continued with the traditional tools even when metal ones existed. Widespread use of iron tools came only after 1000 BCE, in the so-called Iron Age, for instance the Assyrian and Persian periods in Egypt. But even then, the transformation was gradual. It was really in the later classical era, Greco-Roman times, that iron plows and scythes became more accessible, and devices like the water wheel, the sakia, became prevalent to expand irrigation. One significant change over time was not in the farming methods per se, but in the administration. In the older Middle Kingdom periods, most farmland was centrally controlled by the pharaoh or managed through a feudal-like system of local governors called nomarchs. There was a concept that all land belonged to the king, who granted use of it to temples or officials, and by the New Kingdom huge temple estates, especially dedicated to Amun, had developed. There were more instances of private land ownership among nobles. After the Bronze Age in the late period, and under foreign rule, land ownership patterns shifted further, with military settlers or Greek colonists being granted land, for example. But to the farmer working a plot, these political changes may have been barely noticeable in the daily routine. He still plowed, planted, and paid his grain, whether it was to a pharaoh's scribe or to a temple priest or a Ptolemaic Greek landlord. And so looking at the Egyptian agriculture in the long view, it's pretty striking how stable and sustainable it was for such an incredibly long time. Now there were periods of disruption, sure. The end of the Old Kingdom around 2200 saw famine and social strife, likely due in part to low Nile floods and the ensuing agricultural collapse. Yet the Egyptians adapted and recovered, re-establishing order and maximizing their food production again in the Middle Kingdom. Another crisis at the close of the Bronze Age affected the Mediterranean world, and Egypt too experienced invasions and economic stress. But the Nile cycle continued, and the fields still produced. In fact, Egypt's agricultural resilience was the envy of others. Classical historians like Diodorus and Strabo in the 1st century BCE commented on how Egyptian farmers could reliably get 2 harvests a year in some places, and how the Nile never failed to feed multitudes. Perhaps once again a bit of an idealization on their part. The Roman emperor later banked on this reliability. Egypt became the breadbasket of Rome, exporting shiploads of grain to feed the city of Rome and other parts of the empire. And this export was possible because the Egyptian farmer typically grew more than what was needed for subsistence in good year. Well, unlike the Romans, the life of the farmer was still much the same. Under the Romans, rather, the life of the farmer was still much the same. Well, though now their grain tax fed distant masters. It is, however, a testament to the durability of the Nile farming system that it kept functioning under pharaohs, Persians, Greeks, and Romans alike. All pretty impressive. At least I think it is. And just like that, we get to the end of our special on Roman, oh, excuse me, not Roman farming, Egyptian farming. Yeah, I'm going off the rails at the end of the video. I must be tired. Maybe that's enough for tonight. Anyway, let me thank my top tier patrons. It is, who have we got? Let me open the list. Ah, here we are, okay. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Tabry, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian. Are you my mum? That's the name, not a question. Rhonda, Carrie, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Al Tazakian, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Divilo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsvein, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, and Agworm. Thank you very much. Alright, so that's it from me for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And, well, you know, as I always say, lots of love to you all. And I will see you in the next video. Farewell for now.